Room 313. Inside of cramped Wilson Hall on the campus of Ohio University, Will smiled as he sat back in the chair of his dorm room. It was a quiet day, a relaxing Sunday. Rain pelted the one small window in his room, leaving small streams running down the glass panes and over the air conditioning unit inside of it. The linoleum floors felt cold beneath his toes for the first time in months, signaling the arrival of autumn to the Ohio River Valley. Will's roommates were out of town. Well, not too far out of town. They were back home in Chillicothe and Cincinnati. They were enjoying the Thanksgiving holiday with their families. As an out-of-state student from Florida, Will did not have that luxury. It was not worth it to drive 18 hours south to spend maybe a day back home, only to drive 18 hours back to be on time for classes on Monday. So he enjoyed a quiet Thanksgiving by himself, with some fun videos on YouTube to keep him company. As he scrolled through dozens of thumbnails for gaming and fun fact channels and other nonsense, one video in particular caught his attention. It was a video about his school, a fun fact list about the 10 most haunted universities in the United States. Curious, Will opened it up. As the video played, he was stunned to find his school listed near the top. Why was that? He recalled his orientation tour several months back before he began attending the college. The student guiding him and his mother through the school mentioned how there used to be a mental asylum in the section of Ohio University known as the Ridges. Will had never been up there and had only caught fleeting glimpses of the old structure. From what he understood, that building was now offices and art studios. Nothing scary. However, that mental asylum was not the only reason for the university's ranking as a haunted school. Will's eyes widened as he watched a name and number flash over his screen. Wilson Hall, room 313. A bead of sweat dripped down Will's jawline. His eyes drifted from his computer screen to the ceiling. Will was in room 213. He gulped as his hands trembled in his lap. Fear sat heavy in his gut for a moment as a million thoughts rushed through his mind, none of them pleasant. Then logic and reason took over. There was nothing to fear because there was no one staying up there. He scoffed and shook his head, returning his eyes to the video on the screen. That was ridiculous. A bunch of nonsense. There was no such thing as ghosts, hauntings, demons, or anything like that. Besides, he lived in this room for almost 3 months now, and he hadn't heard or encountered anything from the room above him. You would think a ghost would get curious about its neighbors, Will thought, chuckling to himself. His stomach growled. It was almost time for dinner, and the dinner hall was serving a special meal for all the students who didn't leave for Thanksgiving. He needed to get up there before they closed early. With a sigh, Will rose to his feet and walked away from his computer, which kept playing, revealing the reasons why room 313 was believed to be haunted. As he left to eat, he didn't get to hear them. Midnight Stories. The storm continued to batter the small town of Athens, Ohio that night. Rain smacked against Will's window, tapping on the cloudy glass panes like fingers against a fish tank. The storm drowned out any stars or moonlight, leaving only the distant light of lamps, lighting the walkways beyond the walls of Wilson Hall, glowing dimly in the darkness. They cast ominous, pale swaths of light, warped and bent by the droplets of rain clinging to the window. Will lay on his back, staring up through the empty bunk above him, wondering about the room above him. Normally, his roommates would be snoring already, as would he. James would be in the bunk above, the heaviest sleeper of the group, and the only one who always had to wake up before 7 a.m. to go train at the gym. Victor slept in the raised bed on the other side of the room, and he was almost always a tad tipsy from a frat party the night before. Will was the quiet one, the one who preferred to be alone. To him, having the room to himself for Thanksgiving break was a blessing, a peaceful paradise, solace at last. So why couldn't he fall asleep? He rolled over on his side, the thin sheets he used for his covers slipping over his scrawny form. His green eyes landed on the closed laptop on the desk. With a sigh, he swung his legs from the bed and peered at the clock on his phone. 1 in the morning. At least I don't have class tomorrow. He eyed the laptop again. The video he watched from earlier in the day re-entered his mind, playing with his thoughts. Once again, his curiosity got the better of him. I'll relax for a little bit, Will muttered to himself, scratching an itch on the back of his head. Maybe that'll help me fall asleep. He slumped into his desk chair and opened his laptop. Blue light washed over his face, followed by bright white light as YouTube opened up once again. This time, he was surprised to see his recommended feed had changed a little bit. More videos about haunted places littered the page, and each one intrigued him. None more intriguing than a video specifically about Wilson Hall, room 313. Excitement pulsed in his veins as he clicked on it. A low voice hit his ears. The video narrator. He repeated some of the same facts about the room that he'd heard in the first video. The location of the room, that it was supposedly haunted by demons, blah blah blah. Then it mentioned murder, and Will perked up. There were no pictures to the description the narrator gave. No evidence was displayed in the video either, but the details described were gruesome. 20 years ago, 2 girls shared room 313 in Wilson Hall. One was an innocent, naive girl. She was a sweet thing who loved helping others and enjoyed talking to everyone. The other girl, different, a party animal, a wild child who was always getting into trouble, always on academic probation, barely skating by with her grades. Will was familiar with the type, but the 2 girls got along. They became fantastic friends, best friends. Then, one day, out of nowhere, the wild child snapped. She scrawled occult drawings in her notebooks and on the walls. Pentagrams and strange circular markings, scribblings and scrawling that no one could decipher. Her roommate was found dead the next day, brutally slashed and cut apart with a butcher knife. The second girl maintained her innocence throughout the trial. She claimed that she and her roommate were friends, best friends even. She would never harm her. But Athens is a small town, a town filled with superstitious people. They saw the presented evidence, the occult drawings, pictures of the bloody crime scene, and the jury declared her guilty by reason of insanity. She was one of the last people sent to live in the Ridges before being moved elsewhere, forever imprisoned in an asylum for a crime she swore her innocence to. It was tragic and terrifying. The entire story engulfed Will's attention. He could not take his eyes from the screen. A bump sounded above him right as the video ended. Will's heart stopped in his chest. His cursor hovered over the next video. He hesitated to click it. Was his mind playing tricks on him? Was that just a random noise made by an old building? A simple creak of aged beams in the ceiling? No. He knew he heard a thump. A heavy thump at that. And it came from above. And from what the video said, no one can get in there. The university sealed room 313 immediately after the incident. No one was allowed in there. Nothing was supposed to be in there. It's now just storage, supposedly. So, what made the noise? His eyes were glued to the blank white ceiling. They felt heavy, but they stayed open. Fear kept him awake. Fear and morbid curiosity. Nothing exciting ever happened in the dorms. Will's chair groaned against the floor as he pushed it back from the desk. He quickly pulled on some old socks he found on the floor, then slid into his shoes. After making sure he had his room key, he left his room, shutting the door softly behind him, then quietly made his way to the stairs. The stairwell light glowed a comforting cold white as he marched up the concrete steps to the 3rd floor. Once he reached the 3rd floor corridor, he paused, took a breath, and pressed forward. It looked identical to the 2nd floor. A plain beige carpet ran over the floor. It was not a plush, expensive carpet. It was hard, old, and grainy. Clearly, it needed to be replaced. It muffled his footsteps enough to not alarm anyone else staying the weekend at school. This was the girls' floor after all, and the last thing Will needed was an incident report. Carefully, he tiptoed down the hall. One of the overhead lights flickered, its orange glow winking on and off like a strange Morse code. Maybe the third floor had taken notice of him. Maybe it was warning him, trying to ward him off, urging him to leave. No, he wasn't superstitious like that. He wasn't like the locals. He was an out-of-stater and someone who always prided themselves on logic and reason. Never did he believe in the paranormal. Once he reached the room, he would find out what caused the noise. There would be a logical reason. It was probably someone pulling a prank. Or maybe the thump came from the corridor and it was just heavy enough to sound like it came from the room above Will's. Regardless, there was no ghost or demon in room 313. He passed by the dorms, odd on the left and even on the right. He watched numbers quickly pass until finally he was upon it. He was excited. He turned to face the now infamous room. He was standing directly in front of the door of room 313. Will scrutinized the door, studying it closely. The white paint on its surface was new. He pressed a finger against it. So fresh, the paint was still a little tacky. His finger even left a print on the surface of the door. Was that what caused the noise? Maintenance? But there was no evidence of anyone working here at this hour. It made no sense for the custodian to be doing anything to any room right now. Then again, room 313 was no ordinary room. Maybe this was when the university wanted him working on it, to avoid attracting any unnecessary attention. I'm sure they'd want to keep it all hush-hush. So where were the jars of paint then? Where were the brushes? Maybe the custodian finished up just earlier and made the noise while putting his things away. Or was he inside the room, working in there? Will thought about it for a moment. Then he looked at the door again. He blinked as he saw paint in the cracks between the door and the door frame, sealing the door shut like glue. There were no breaks in the painted seal. No one was in there tonight. No way. What made the thump? Will furrowed his brow. His hand reached out toward the brass doorknob. Perhaps he could get inside and find out. Perhaps he could discover the secrets of room 313. Despite his better instincts telling him to leave it alone and go back to bed, he couldn't help but want to find out more. Just as his fingers grazed the cold doorknob, a voice startled him from down the hall. A yelp escaped uncontrollably from Will's throat as he wrenched his hand away from the door and spun to face the bark he heard. The nighttime custodian stared at him. He was an old-timer with thinning gray hair atop his head and heavy, bushy eyebrows. A beard filled with speckles of white and gray ran in scraggly rivers from his chin to his chest. He wore the usual gray uniform of any school custodian. Above his left breast, Will spotted his name tag, John. Nothing unusual. Hi, Will gulped, waving a hand. John the custodian frowned as he approached. What are you doing up here? This is the girls' floor. Will grimaced. Well, he gestured at room 313. I was curious. John the custodian paused. His icy blue eyes flicked at the door. You better not have messed up the paint on that. He gestured toward the door with a nod. I didn't, I swear. Will put his hands up as if a gun were on him. His voice panicked, hoping the man wouldn't notice the blatant fingerprint. John hummed as he eyed Will. He glanced at the door again, then returned his eyes to Will. Go back to your room, boy. There's nothing up here or in there for you. As he was turning to leave, Will thought for a moment. John, he said as he turned to face the man. He gulped as the old man just stared at him, unimpressed by the use of his name. Do you know what happened here? Will continued. Everyone knows what happened in there, John grunted out matter-of-factly. Well, do you know anything else? Anything different? Anything more? John drew back, inclined his chin at Will, and glowered. His calloused, wrinkled hands folded in front of him as he thought about Will's question. Yeah, I was here when it happened. I know as much as anyone else. And that's not much, and it isn't anything I care to be kicking around about. You were here? Will exclaimed, excitement in his voice. His eyes widened. Did you know the girls who lived here? He motioned to the door. Yeah, I knew of them. Nice girls they were. Learned their names after the trial from the newspapers. Rebecca and Jennifer. John looked away to somewhere else for a moment, then back to Will. Very nice they were. He trailed off a little. Do you think the one killed the other? John scoffed. Do I think Jennifer killed Rebecca? That ain't for me to decide. The jury made up their mind. I got no reason to look back on it further than that. But Jennifer denied it the whole time. The girl was nice, but turns out she was also nuts. That doesn't mean she wasn't capable. But did she do it? Will argued again, prodding at John to continue to talk to him about it. John had had it with Will's incessant questions. His heavy brow furrowed, and a frown creased his lips behind his thick beard. He shook his head and gestured at the door sternly and said, "There's nothing in there for you, and there's nothing for you on this floor. Go back to your room already, before I wake one of the RAs to deal with you." Will accepted defeat. John, the custodian, was done talking, and Will didn't want to deal with a sleepy, grumpy RA at this time of night. So, with a resigned sigh, he bid John good night, then turned and headed for the stairs. As he walked, he could feel John's eyes burning a hole in his back. When he reached the stairwell, he glanced back at room 313. John had just started walking away. Will gulped. The old man was watching him leave. Creepy. Well, I guess he has every right to be irritated it is late, Will thought to himself. Still, the whole interaction was unnerving. John obviously didn't want to talk about it, and what little he did give Will only stirred up more questions for him. It did not matter. The custodian's attitude was not going to deter Will. Something made a heavy noise in room 313. Something had stirred inside the sealed room, and tomorrow night, Will's going to find out what it was. Maybe he would unravel the entire mystery of what actually happened in room 313. Friday night, Will stayed awake. He didn't watch YouTube. He didn't play games. He sat on his bed, shoes on his feet, dark clothes on his body, ready, waiting. The clock on his phone ticked away, until finally it was 1 a.m, the same time of night when he last went to check on the room. There were no bumps above Will's room today, no indication of anything strange. He listened intently all day and night. Nothing. Throughout the day, he had done more research on the case of Wilson Hall in room 313, but his research dug up little more than he already knew. He could not find where Jennifer, the supposed murderer, was sent after here. He couldn't locate much information about her past, or who she was as a person outside of some vague trial notes, all seemingly painting a murderous picture. The same happened with the murdered roommate, Rebecca. The only information Will could dig up was her obituary and a few comments made by her friends 20 years ago. I guess some friends warned her about Jennifer. They told her she was a bad person, a bad influence, someone who could get her in trouble. They testified against Jennifer, painting her as a murderous madwoman, despite her friendship with Rebecca. Will found it strange how little he could find about the case. But the case didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was getting into room 313, and he knew how he was going to do it. It was unlikely John the custodian would be in Wilson Hall again at the same time of night. Will made sure to check if any further maintenance needed to be done. The RA he spoke to said none was needed at all, so the coast should be clear, and John shouldn't be anywhere around the campus tonight. Will was armed with a screwdriver, his key, and a lockpick he fashioned out of a bobby pin. That should be more than enough to break into room 313. The screwdriver would break the paint seal along with his key. The lockpick would break the lock and reveal the room's mysteries to him. Will took in a deep breath, rose to his feet, moved to the door, and put his plan into motion. Making sure no one was roaming around, he quickly made his way to the stairwell. Once in the cold stairwell, Will paused. The normally solid light in the ceiling was flickering. A warning? Maintenance needed? Perhaps the latter, probably not the former. I should call this off, Will thought. The thought came out of nowhere. An uneasy feeling started to work in his stomach as he crept up the stairs and neared the 3rd floor. I'm not someone who should be breaking and entering into places. Even if they're unoccupied, I should go back to bed. Another thought battered its way in, but he did not turn around. He did not go back down the stairs. He reached the third-floor landing and entered the corridor, letting the heavy stairwell door click shut behind him. There was no one on this floor. It was an empty tomb of dorm doors. With a gulp, Will pressed forward, his pace growing faster as he rushed past the first few doors. Finally, he screeched to a stop, his gaze fixed on the plaque with the number 313. The brass numbers glowed in the yellow light, showing his haggard, tired reflection. This was it. This was the last chance for Will to turn around and leave this alone. His last chance to quell his curiosity before it came back to bite him. Or he could have all the answers he sought in this mess of murder and insanity and demons and ghosts and off-limit rooms. His hand touched the doorknob. His other hand brushed against the still sticky paint, leaving a mark. More evidence. Geez, what kind of paint did old John use after all? Will thought. With a shaky breath, Will dragged the point of a screwdriver across the paint seal. It would only take a little pressure, just a little muscle, and as little noise as possible, and the seal would be broken, allowing him to pick the lock and get in. When he moved to break the paint seal, he froze at the sight. It was already cracked. His heart thumped in his chest. Someone already broke the seal. Fear swelled in his heart. Instinct told him to back up from the door now and go back to his room. To forget about this entire project, delete the search history on his computer, and move on with his life. What did he have to gain from figuring out what went on inside this room anyway? Why did he want to learn whether or not this place really was haunted? So what if it was? Because he lived here. He lived right below this infamous room. He did not just want to know what was in the room. He needed to know. Swallowing hard, Will's hand wrapped around the brass doorknob. The metal was warm to the touch, as if someone had grasped it not long before he'd arrived. John, maybe? Will thought. Sweat beaded on his brow, despite the cold temperature in the corridor. It was already unlocked. Alarm bells rang in his head. Every natural instinct in him flared to life. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he twisted the doorknob and inched the door open. He was undeterred now, committed to ending this mystery. His hands trembled, but he could not stop opening the door. It swung inward and the shadows yawned around him, swallowing him into their cold embrace. Finally, with a deep breath, he pushed the door all the way open and stepped inside. Nothing. It was a bare room. No furniture. No air conditioning unit in the window. A fine layer of dust sat on the built-in shelves to his left. A couple of cockroach carcasses rested near the corner of the room. No bunk beds occupied the tile floor. Not even any boxes for storage. Just an empty room. Bare. Nothing except Will's eyes fixed on something. Footprints in the dust on the floor. The door slammed shut. Will's heart lodged in his throat as he stood still, hoping that perhaps whatever was sharing the room with him, ghost, demon, or otherwise, would not see him. If he did not look at it, or if it did not notice him, then it would not harm him. Maybe it would even let him leave in peace. Cold sweat formed on his brow when a heavy step marched toward him from behind. The foot thumped, making the same noise that had sounded above his head one night ago. His eyes squeezed shut, and a whimper escaped his sealed lips. Something leathery brushed against the nape of his neck. "I told you." Will's eyes shot wide open. His heart stopped in his chest. It was hard to breathe. Every time he tried to inhale, he couldn't. Terror choked him, and its grip grew tighter around his throat as he heard the telltale sound of a sharp knife releasing from a sheath. It wasn't a ghost or demon in this room. It was something much worse. A monster. One that had been roaming Wilson Hall for years, waiting for another opportunity to strike, hoping someone would make the mistake of setting it off again. It was the kind of monster that kids don't really think about, but adults fear the most. A killer. A bloodthirsty butcher. Will's eyes looked at the footprints by his feet one more time. Then he noticed it. On the edge of one of the boot prints in the dust was a sliver of white paint, outlining the track of a large boot, the kind of boots only worn by people in physically demanding professions, like a maintenance man. "Why?" Will croaked. Dark chuckles sounded behind him. "Because I find nosy people, just like those two girls, the most fun to do. Plus, you ruined my paint job." He strode closer to Will, close enough that Will could feel his breath on the nape of his neck. "Now there is something in here for you." The evil words slithered down Will's spine. He opened his mouth to scream, but didn't get the chance. "Me."